I am Heidi Schmalbach, the Program Director for Planet Texas 2050. I don't have a long list of things to tell you about today, just a short one. And then I'm going to pass it on to our step-in moderator and chair of Planet Texas 2050, Dr. Paula Passalacqua, professor, as of very recently, full professor, Passalacqua. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to let you all know about a few things that are not on the schedule. Of course, the schedule for today and tomorrow is on the website. You can also access it through a QR code on the entry tables. A couple of things are not on there. In room C, which is across the hall, catty corner from this room, throughout the day we're playing our core flagship research projects, have short films that were made to explain the work that they do, and those are running on a loop throughout the day. So if you have 20 minutes to sit down and relax, check them out. You can learn a lot more about the work that is happening within our flagship projects. In the lobby and also in this room, which I didn't write down the number of, E, I believe, we also have a sort of offshoot project of one of our flagships, the Stories of Ancient Resilience. It's set up so that you can listen on the computer to a recording of some young people in Austin reading a poem, and then it asks you to respond to that poem by writing a love letter to the future that will be shared with young people in future iterations of the work. So if you have a little bit of time, it's really moving, sit down, listen to it, and please contribute your voice to that. It'll be really meaningful to that team. What else? This is very important. It is Amplify Austin Day. And if you don't know about Amplify, if you are not aware of Amplify Austin Day, it is a day that we encourage folks to make contributions to nonprofit organizations that are doing meaningful work in our community. There are many, many, many of them. I'm sure you all have your favorites, but I will make a little plug for Forklift Dance Works, who are here on our panel. After you hear about the amazing work that they do, maybe consider sending a little Amplify Austin love their way. I think that's all of the announcements. You know that the bathroom is down the hall to the left. I think that's important. I already introduced Dr. Paula Passalacqua. This is an amazing panel that has been organized by us collectively. It's called Revealing the Invisible Systems That Support Us, and it is featuring Dr. Fernanda Leite, who is a professor in the Civil and Architectural Engineering program, as well as a co-lead of our Equitable and Regenerative Cities Flagship project. We have Chrissy Marty of Forklift Dance Works, who's the Associate Artistic Director and Community, Chrissy, what's the rest of your title? Community Collaborations Director. You'll learn all about their amazing work. And then Ramesh Swaminathan, who is an Assistant Director with Austin Watershed Protection. Really incredible panel, and I appreciate all of you being here. Take it away, Dr. Passalacqua.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. Yeah, I just stepped into this panel about 2 minutes ago, so there's a little bit of improv going on here, but the team is so organized that we got it down, I think. So we're gonna start with a round of introductions. So we're gonna go in the order of Fernanda, then Christian, then Ramesh. And I'm gonna be playing videos that represent their work. And then we're gonna go into more of a Q&A. And whenever Christian will be able to be here, you're gonna see a swap in the moderator, and we'll do that. So all very fluid. So Fernanda, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so like Heidi said, I'm an academic, so I'm a professor in civil engineering, and I'm part of Planet Texas 2050. And the reason why this work started, so the idea is that we have a lot of infrastructure systems, and this coming from a civil engineer, right? So we design and build infrastructure systems, these systems that make our lives possible in the modern world, that build resilience in our cities. But many of them are invisible. We can't see them, and oftentimes we don't understand them because they are not visible to the general public. And so this is an example here, what you're seeing of the Seaholm Power Plant in downtown Austin. So you might have been on the dog park in that grassy area between the old power plant building and the river. There's a lot of people that walk their dogs there. Underneath that area is a tank that stores 325,000 gallons of water. So that whole power plant area has been transformed into a rainwater harvesting system. And it collects and stores that water, and it also creates a buffer when there's extreme stressor event. So when there's more rain or heavy rains, it creates that buffer before it floods into the river stream there. So if you go to the next slide, Paula. So with support from Microsoft, I think you have to click one more time for it to play here. And this was done by, I'll give a shout out to Gabrielle Lee, she's sitting there in the back. She'll give a talk in more detail about what you're seeing this right after this panel. So with support from Microsoft, Microsoft is a supporter also of Planet Texas 2050. So we were thinking about, well, how can we make these invisible systems visible, right? So how can we enable people to understand what may be below ground, what are these systems that build resilience in our cities? So here we're leveraging augmented reality. We're actually using a mixed reality headset, Microsoft HoloLens 2, to be able to visualize this water infrastructure at the Seaholm Power Plant. And the idea is that we would be able to then simulate how the system would perform given different scenarios. We would be able to educate the public of what these systems, what these parts and each part of the system does and how it performs. And we're hoping to continue this work and doing this also with another study that Paula is the PI on for the Department of Energy, that we're modeling flooding for the next 30 years in Southeast Texas, in an area that's very vulnerable, that suffers a lot of acute on chronic stressor events. So we're hoping to use this to engage communities and different stakeholders in the design of climate resilient infrastructure systems. So that's where this whole idea started. And then we have, I'm going to hand it off to my co-panelists here, because there's so many other ways of making invisible systems visible. And forklift is a great example of making invisible labor visible. And so I'll hand it off to Christy.
Thanks,
with that.
Fernanda. I was just getting my note. I'm going to take notes. I have questions for you. Well, I just want to say we're so excited to be here. And I'm going to stand up and let this play as I talk as well. But inspired by the movement of work and really public place, at Forklift Dance Works, we make theatrical productions with unexpected performers. That was our composer, Graham Reynolds, who you might expect, but who you might not expect is the Austin Watershed Protection employees and their staff. And so this is a little bit of an introduction here to both Forklift and to Watershed. So we create collaboratively with performers to allow us to share often unheard stories of individual workers, their workforces, and communities. Every forklift show is a shared creation with choreographers and with workers. So here you see, this is a little pre-show choreography that happens naturally of the dance of a loader, a skid steer operator, and a dump truck to clean this part of Waller Creek that leads into a pond for this flood control facility. So our artistic staff embeds really for months with workers to learn about their work and to make shows that reflect the skill, the dignity, and the drama of their lives and work. So we believe everyone is creative, and that by using our collective creativity, we're making art that really invites people to hear a story they hadn't heard before, see a civic issue in a new way, in a brighter light, and to feel more deeply connected to their community. So right now, I don't know if we can get the volume up on the video a little bit. Is that possible, Meredith? Thank you. Because you'll hear some of the stories of our watershed, honestly, and the people who stored it. This is Thomas Guerrera, who's the supervisor at the Waller Creek Tunnel Inlet Facility. and Travis, a crew lead there. And when there's a rain event, this is what they do. They come in, look at the monitors that they have, and then observe the pond and how things are working, and they open the tunnel to take in excess water that comes down this really small channel, honestly, of Waller Creek. So it might be the middle of the night, it might be whatever, but there is, actually Ramesh you were just saying there's a monitoring site right here on Waller Creek at 23rd, right at the bridge that goes over to Winship. And that when that monitor hits 400 CFS, 500 CFS, cubic feet per second of water going by, that's like a bunch of bathtubs, right, going by per second. That they initiate, that they come in, they're called in when it hits a lower level, they're called in to assess the situation. So here you go. So what you just heard, that's great. So what you just heard was Sean, who's a crew member who goes out to observe low water crossings, places where water might overtake the road, and talks to the flood early warning system on the radio to decide whether to close a crossing or open it. So yeah, we can forward to Ramesh's slide, which is one more past this. I have a Lake Creek video we could save for later. Take it away, Ramesh. I kind of already stole some of your thunder.
Well, I'm so glad you did. It's gonna be hard to follow that act. So my name is Ramesh Swaminathan. I'm Assistant Director for the Watershed Protection Department. In case many of you are not aware, it's with the City of Austin, and we are the drainage utility for the City of Austin, which means our mission is to protect lives from flooding. We try to reduce the risk of flooding. We try to prevent pollution of the water, and we also ensure the stream banks, the erosion of the stream banks are not happening as well. And so I sit on the executive team for the Watershed Protection Department, and most of the people who were in that video, which makes me so proud and inspires me every time I see it, because I was trying to be like, man, I have some energy for this talk, and show me that thing. I was like, all right, ready to go. Because every one of those guys are on my team, and these are sort of like almost half of the Watershed Protection Department are the field employees. And these are what we call as front employees, essential employees. There are many words to describe them, but they are the ones who are basically going to be out there protecting lives in the middle of a storm. It's sort of symbolically, you saw the people walking with those barricades, but of course, for Waller Creek, we have these triggers, such as on the one on 23rd Street, but we have fairly more elaborate flood early warning systems. And just like Fernanda mentioned, we do predictive modeling for the entire city of Austin, and we are a pretty good idea of where all the flash flooding is, where the low water crossings are, and we deploy crews to go to each of those crossings, mostly in the middle of the night usually, and they put out these barricades to basically shut down the streets so that people don't go down and get drowned or get hydroplaned and things like that. So I'm so excited and sort of inspired that we got to work with what they do, and I'm hoping that we'll have more conversations about it today, because I think a lot of what we are doing, what we did with Forklift was to basically shine a light on some of the unsung heroes, and there's just some incredible work they do, and so I'll stop talking because I know that's one of the things we'll talk about, right? I'll stop talking.
Good. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Cristian Mendez Aguirre, or Christian Mendez Aguirre. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Theater and Dance, and I will be moderating this panel today. I'm a theater person, so being on time is late. Being early is on time, and on time means you're late. I was dealing with a family emergency this morning, so this is why I was late. But I got a phone call right as I was walking out the door, and so that's why I was late. But thank you all for your flexibility and your patience, and thank you, Paula, for jumping in. I'm a theater person, and that means that and a director in particular, and that means that I think about the line of what's visible and what's invisible to the audiences I'm working with quite a bit. And so I was really excited when Heidi and Katie and I were discussing this particular panel about sort of really thinking sort of big picture, in a big picture, what it means to think about what is visible and what is invisible for us in terms of the systems that support our daily life, but also in moments of crisis. And so my first question for our panelists, because we have, there's points of convergence, but we're also working across disciplines and across institutions. And we are in a room full of people from various disciplines and various interests. And so I wanted to ask our panelists if they would like to share in your area of work, what are things that you would count as being visible, and what are things that you would count as being invisible? And we'll just to sort of have a bit of a ground, a lowest common denominator, so to speak, from where we can start our conversation. So I don't know, I think we can popcorn it, but up to you.
I can start. So from an engineering, urban infrastructure systems, or a building systems perspective, it's what makes cities and buildings operate, right? So the invisible systems would be water infrastructure systems, pipelines. In buildings, it could be the building systems, the various building systems, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, fire protection, all of that sometimes are visible, sometimes are not visible, right? So right here, if you look up in the ceiling above, you see these diffusers above that. There's a variable air volume box. There are a bunch of pipes that connect to the sprinkler. Where are the sprinkler systems in this room? Oh yeah, I'm glad they're here. But there's piping and there's ducts. There's return and fresh air ducts. So all of these systems that oftentimes are not visible, but are what make the operations of this this larger system, this building, possible. So there's a reason for systems, and we're going to get into that in a bit, the reasons for why some systems are invisible and some are invisible, but we'll leave it at that.
That's awesome. Well, as a choreographer and director as well, I think about, the backstage space is Obviously, not designed not to be seen, and actually the word obscene comes from the Greek tradition of off stage. You know, when someone got their head cut off, they just did it off stage and came back with a head. You know, like that's really where it came from. So that sense of what is designed to be kind of hidden. Is that my?
Maybe clip the clothing rather than.
I'm gonna do a little bit of both. Sorry about that.
Yes.
Great, there it is. Sorry you were listening to my shirt, y'all. Sorry about that. So when I think that's a large part of our work, right? And then also working as a nonprofit arts organization, there's so much that happens to make that possible. So that's why we would be excited about a gift to Amplify Austin today. And if you add in hashtag Tito's, hashtag love Tito's, our favorite local vodka company, will donate an extra $25. So even if you give $5, you can turn it into $30 today only at Amplify Austin. So thanks for that plug. But really, there's a lot of work that goes into making that happen. But our artwork, though, is really thinking about what is that unseen system and who created it, right? Who created that unseen system? And oftentimes people are working, at night, in places not everyone can get to, like linemen on poles or underground or all of those things. So we're really looking at who is doing that work and what is their skill. Honestly, initially we look at what is their physical skill that takes to do that, what is their expertise. So that's really where we start to collaborate, and I think that when I think about visible and invisible, it's also like to who, right? Because really who's looking and who's not looking. Yeah, so when I think about the people who work on that tunnel and who are in that tunnel, I have never seen that tunnel other than in a picture, but the workers that I got to collaborate with and Ramesh got to walk in there and see that from the inside. It goes a giant thing that goes all under downtown. So yeah, thinking about who gets to do that and what stories do they have, what perspectives do they have to share with us.
I love it. I always like to follow her because she's telling a lot of my stories. So I did.
Do it backwards next time.
Yeah, right. No. I'm okay with it. I just created this slide because a lot of what she described are there. So what you see in the bottom, sort of like these are the ones that's below grade, the Waller Creek Tunnel. It's a mile-long tunnel that starts at 12th and Red River, goes all the way up to Lady Bird Lake, and it is the largest capital project in the history of Watershed Protection Department. It is a $150 million program, and there's a whole 2 or 3 part presentation on Waller Creek Tunnel by itself, but I would just talk about resilient infrastructure to protect downtown from flooding, economic development of open green spaces. There's so many huge impacts, but it sort of just to tee it off, I sort of intentionally brought these pictures. These are cross sections of the Waller Creek Tunnel, like at different parts of it. This is kind of the main tunnel, and that's like there are connected tunnels. There's one at 4th Street, and there's one on 8th Street, and that's when the 4th Street connects with it. And I kind of intentionally brought this picture because to Chrissy's point, see, these are the guys who actually built the tunnel. We took this picture like a couple of days before we put water in it, and that's probably the last time these guys saw it. Frankly, most people see it, but a lot of the guys who built the tunnel are largely forgotten. And those guys, they build it, they come very early in the morning, they work really hard, and there's a lot of stories behind their lives that we don't get to see. And then, of course, as a result of all this, what you see is above, right? That's kind of what I wanted to present is what's visible and what's invisible and to who. Like if you look at Central Health, there's I don't know if how long you've been in Austin, that used to be a parking lot that got torn down. There's a new fantastic building. Just to the west of it is this beautiful Waterloo Park. If you haven't been, please do. It's a great park. And then, there's Waterloo Park in the middle that I just took another picture of it. And then Waterline, which is going to be the tallest building in Texas, I believe. And that building is a result of the tunnel project because we vacated the floodplain and they could now construct this building in what used to be a floodplain. I mean, it's this huge like we couldn't have built the tallest building that's going to be literally visible, right? It's going to be pretty tall. So that's kind of the result of it is what is very, very visible. And then the stories and everything else, of course, the infrastructure itself is below grade, but all the stories for the people who work on it to keep it safe, because it's not just to build the tunnel, but it also needs to do its job, or else all these economic development that's happening, well, we would not be able to sustain that if those things continue to flood. So that those stories are also kind of hidden.
Thank you. So if we think of the tunnels and what's above them, the performance and the built environment as the products, and this is kind of where I was going to go as well. We can already see some a division between visible and invisible, between process and product, right? Like we think of of this building, but we don't think about, or normally when we talk about the built environment, we don't always talk about the process of getting the buildings, like the design process, the construction process, the engineering process, right? And so, and with the performances, we have the backstage, but there's also, and those of you who make performance and who are artists in the space know, there is a lot of rehearsal that goes into making a performance, and very laborious, very laborious and work-intensive process that we also tend to separate when we're discussing what we do, right? Likewise, with the tunnels, there's almost a couple of layers here, because the tunnels could be the invisible to what's above, but then we have the stories of the people who built the tunnels, who are invisible to the tunnels themselves. So we can begin. There's some threads there, right? About what are the things that we perceive and the things that we tend to conceal. I'm curious, where do you three in particular think that division comes from? Why, or how does that line get drawn between what we think of as visible and visible? And we'll start with Ramesh this time.
Actually, I'm dead serious. I like Chrissy to go in front of me. See, when we think of this, I mean, I've thought about this a lot, right? I mean, this was after we got this topic, fantastic topic. There's so many threads to it. I think the people who build these things are usually, so there's got to be a conversation about vulnerable communities and the people who take up these jobs and who they are, and they'll tend to be part of the low-income, field workers, and they are the ones who tend to take those roles, and they are, almost all of them are invisible at some point or the other. I mean, that's when they construct it, and then the conversation also goes into when they're maintaining it. Again, they are invisible until something goes wrong, and we talked about it at some point that they become really visible when things go wrong, right? When flooding, it does floods, and everything's we all went through this crisis a few weeks back, and all of a sudden everybody knows who's Austin Energy and who runs Austin Energy. Everybody knows that. And we talk about it often within Watershed protection, is that the next one could be us. We haven't had a flood in a while, and we sure hope that you don't experience some kind of poor outcome because of the flooding, because then you'll suddenly know. I don't have to introduce Watershed protection after that, because you'll all will know who Watershed protection is. So we get visible all of a sudden, and to Chrissy's point about to who and why, I think there is that part of, we have to build these complex things. It's a skill. Pouring concrete is an art. I mean, I have to tell you, at the Waller Creek Inlet, we have almost 40,000 cubic yards of concrete. I mean, that's an engineering marvel. And you don't pour that kind of concrete if you don't know how to do it. And then it's real, and the guys who do it, they're incredibly talented, and you wouldn't know they exist, or you know what they do. They're largely visible. So that's the part that I sort of gravitate towards, who do you think about when you talk about infrastructure? Because when you look at the engineers and the scientists, they're the ones with the desktops and doing all of that. They're the ones making presentations, and they're writing papers and things like that. But the people who actually construct it a lot of times tend to be invisible.
Woo, Ramesh. Now I got to follow you. So this just for reference, this right here is the tunnel inlet facility, and where we saw the loader and stuff was kind of up right behind those trees. So just as a reference of where that is. I think what I love about my job is that I get to kind of weave in and out of that line. I get to come above it and below it, right? Of who's visible to who and how, and so getting to, as an artist, getting access to be able to do that is pretty cool. That I get to hang out with Ramesh and hear him talk about concrete. It's pretty awesome, and then being able to share the work of that team, of the Watershed team. I'm part of the Watershed team. It's 400 people, right? We had 50 people in this show, and to an audience of 2,500 total, and so we get to share those stories, but then also, folks get to interact with me and my team, a team of 6 choreographers. When have you ever worked with 6 choreographers on one show, right? So it's kind of a fun way to get to blur that, to travel that line. I like to think, of what's visible and invisible.
So for me, I'll wear my educator hat. So I think for me that the line between invisible and visible from an infrastructure system, building systems perspective, has to do with educating and having our future designers, our future builders understand these systems. And I talk about this a lot on campus, on multiple campus discussions. Christian was in my sustainable systems class a few years ago. And so we talk about campus being a living, an opportunity that campus and all of these systems and all of these infrastructure systems around us in our city, about being a living laboratory. So our students can see these systems and be able to walk through a huge tunnel and understand how that is designed and how that's built and how it connects to other systems. So it was lovely. Many of us, that video that we saw earlier of the performance, the forklift performance, many of us from Planet Texas 2050 were there that night, and I remember seeing all those drones flying over it and recording that. And that's such a wonderful learning experience. Many of us were geeking out saying, oh, look at that. We were describing what we were seeing because we understood each of those systems. And what a wonderful learning opportunity that is to explain to the general public what that is, right? And what those essential workers are doing to keep us all safe and to build resilience around us and in our cities.
Thank you. And I'm curious, so pulling out a few threads, we talked about sort of this line of like awareness of how things are built or how they function, right? That Fernanda was mentioning, and Ramesh and Chrissy, you were both talking about labor as well, right? Like that line between visible and invisible gets drawn a little bit when we begin to think of like who does the labor to sustain, either to build something or to maintain it or to pull it together in the case of a performance. This wasn't a question that we talked about in the call, but I'm curious. Do you think, not so much from the people who work in these fields, but from the perspective of folks who use the buildings or go to the park or go to the performance, to what extent do you think the aesthetic experience of these places, of a building or a performance or of the watershed tunnels, plays into where we draw that line? Where do you think aesthetics and pleasure factors in where we draw that line? And we don't have to go in any order. We can just popcorn.
I was going to say enormously, I don't know how much you all know about Waterloo Park and the whole open chain of parks. It was very intentional. There was a big design competition where we brought in like nationwide landscape architects teams to come up with their vision of how these parks are going to be, and every one of them had like fantastic ideas. And Waterloo Park, as you see right now, is sort of like an organic evolution of what that whole park was envisioned for this community. A lot of that was aesthetics and the idea of trying to sort of put this beautiful park right next to a world-class sort of functioning flood control facility. That by in itself is kind of an interesting relationship there, and there's a lot that went into it. Every little thing, you mentioned that there was some place where they have like a below grade tank full of water. There's a huge cistern right in the middle of Waterloo Park that collects rainwater that we reuse for irrigation, which is part of the water conservation story for City of Austin. Practically every plant, every tree is a native species to City of Austin, because that's something watershed protection is very deeply passionate about. We have what's the word I'm looking for? We brought in 2 major trees from Capitol Campus onto Waterloo Park because our mission is to protect trees. I mean, moving a tree is like moving a space shuttle almost. And we moved it actually, and we have 2 of those trees in Waterloo Park. So a lot of that aesthetics was blended in with our sort of our vision of what how we wish to protect the environment.
Go ahead.
Oh, go, no, go, Fernanda.
I was just going to add that there is a strong line of research in the architecture domain on evidence-based design, right, and how space impacts occupant health and occupant performance, right? So how we design our physical spaces really does have an impact on our lives. And that's one of the reasons why you see hospitals with more natural lighting now, with more access to outdoor spaces, university campuses with so many beautiful buildings to allow students to be more creative and to interact with one another and to be more visible in what they're doing, right? A lot of laboratories that are surrounded by glass so people can be inspired by what they're seeing other people working on as well. So the physical space can have a tremendous impact on our lives, on our health, and on our productivity, on how we become inspired by the work that we do. And so that there's that line there of visible and invisible from a quality of the built environment as well.
I'm just gonna jump in real quick. It strikes me then that we're like associating. So what I'm assuming something here, which is the assumption is that hiding the pipes and the wiring and everything is a way to make the rooms more pleasant, right, or less busy. But there's an aesthetic judgment there, right? That's what's that I'm interested in. That there is like at some point someone or multiple someones made that decision that like sort of concealing those systems that support us is an aesthetic decision, and that makes us enjoy or more productive but then you have the flip side, which is revealing, like having the walls, like having the big glass walls, like being able to see what's inside a building, or seeing like having the stormwater drain system that captures water right underneath the park. Like it seems like I don't know that it's necessarily a pendulum that's swinging back, but it seems like there's a little bit of an intention to reveal instead of conceal as much as it had been before.
To connect back with the campus as a living laboratory, right? So some spaces on campus are intentionally left, the building systems are intentionally left visible. So if we go into the EER, the Engineering, Education, and Research Center, just a few blocks down, there's a maker studio there, 2 stories with a bunch of 3D printers and CNC machines. In that space, so the whole building, of course, a lot of the building systems are concealed, but in that space, all of the mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems are visible. And it was done intentionally that way because students are tinkering, they're creating, they're making, and they should be able to see how that space is operating as well. And so intentionally that space was left with all the building systems very visible. So all of the students, and that's a very interdisciplinary space, all students from multiple disciplines use that space. And that was the intent from the design phase.
Those are great questions. I think I have the same question about aesthetics as I do about visible and invisible. It's like, who's aesthetic? Right? That there are maybe things that we maybe hide or reveal depending on who's designing them and who wants to see them and who values them in certain ways, right? So I think, some person can look at this and see the light, right? The beautiful light. Ramesh looks at it and sees the art of concrete, right? So I think it's also like by whose perspective, and that's such a great question of thinking of like who's designing that, or what, especially thinking not only from our own individual aesthetics. I like this color more than this color. I respond to this versus shape versus form, or line versus form. So. But also thinking culturally, right? What different cultures value and what they are showing or not showing. So I have no answer, just more questions.
Can I just add that that's one of the reasons why I just love the project we did, because she did shine light on the people who are usually not shown. I'm so inspired and so grateful for, like, I'm going to show that YouTube to pretty much everybody, because in terms of, like, just bear with me for a minute, because most of my team are not the most highest paid. A lot of the existential issues in the city of Austin, this community touches them in a very real way. A lot of them go from paycheck to paycheck, and we constantly struggle with trying to make sure they're well compensated, their morale is good, and we do all of those things. And one of the things I felt, in fact, that is by far the best team building effort, was this thing. Because when you came to the inlet, which was kind of like the, what do you call the room? Backstage, right? So like that the building was the backstage. If you go in there, the energy was electric. I mean, these guys were so pumped up about it. I couldn't have done a better team building than just this. And that's kind of the best part about doing what you did, like revealing that you gave them an opportunity to shine some light on them. And I think that's why I was so like, I couldn't hire a Harvard professor to come and do team building better than this thing. So it was so good. So.
Thank you, Ramesh.
How do you like that?
Yeah.
Amplify Austin, right?
Amplify.
Amplify
Hashtag love
Austin
Tito's.
Day,
Yeah.
March 1st.
So I just want to add, though, that like you say that about us, that you're inspired by what we did, but we were inspired by the work that's happening. So I think it's also about perspective. It's just so about perspective. Just like watching those guys climb down into confined space to work in the tunnel, I remember I was talking to someone who's like, oh my God, you guys made cleaning the creek look dramatic. And I was like, cleaning the creek is dramatic. There's glass, there's hazardous waste, there was a murder around one of the creek spots one day we were out there working it's intense work, no joke. So I think it's also just like the perspective, and also getting to be downtown and surrounded by water and shade and trees was amazing. There's that's exciting too. So I think it's just about y'all inspire us, Ramesh. I'm just saying.
I'll take that too. Yeah, I think Christy's right. And talking about the hidden and all of that, going back to the design competition, I just want to share this. Waller Creek, and by the way, I think that's the most studied creek in the history of University of Texas, I think. I think there's like 15 PhDs on Waller Creek alone. Yeah. Everybody has studied Waller Creek. But one of the major themes for all the architecture teams was that as an urban creek, Waller Creek was at least the lower Waller Creek from, say, 15th all the way down to the lake was mostly forgotten. It was sort of like a blighted part of town. It was mostly hidden. We wanted to let people in, and some of the project we are going to do from the creek mouth, rather, where the creek enters the lake and coming backwards, we're going to intentionally build these sort of bridges, these lattice bridges across the creek, so people can go and sort of get themselves immersed in nature, sort of revealing nature, if you will. That's one of the things that was kind of largely hidden. Now, thanks to the tunnel where it's not flooding anymore, now we can construct these green spaces for people to go and enjoy nature. So.
And I would also, following up, trying to sort of pull some threads together here. It seems to me that there is an aesthetic decision in terms of deciding kind of what is concealed and what is visible. There's also a little bit of reflection of, or like an enactment of our values, of like what is important to us, right? Like what's important to us in terms, for example, talking about the collaboration form, The Way of Water, like it was important for both, for all the partners involved in the project to shine this light. Thinking about the built environment and the living lab on campus, it is important. Speaking of the tinkering lab in EER, like it is important to have in that space to have sort of this exposed area, but in other spaces, like the circuitry and the engineering. So yeah, it is an enactment of our values, and to me that also means there's a little bit of like a story that's getting that is getting sort of perpetuated or repeated about like who we are, what we do, what's important. To give you an analog from what I do, which is in theater. In theater, if you've seen a play recently. #Amplify Austin Day. If you've seen a play recently, or if you've seen a movie recently, if you don't go to the theater, normally we're not like we don't know that much about the process. The expectation when we consume these forms of media is that you show up, you see it from the beginning to the end, and that's it. And if you're really interested in it, you can go and like buy the books about it, or the merch, or like look the interviews. But when, as artists, like we don't think about involving the audience in the sort of process of how things are made. Oh, thank you. In the process of how things are made, and so, as an artist, I like to sort of resist that in my work, and we can talk about that, what that looks like afterwards. But I'm curious, for you all, like, what do you think is the story that that we're living in, based on like what is visible or what isn't visible? in your area. And this also wasn't in the questions that we talked about. So
I'll let
we-
you take that so that I know what clue after that.
Okay. Can you ask that question one more time?
yeah. So
Land me the question one more time.
Totally, yeah. So if we backtrack a little bit and we think of sort of, so far we've discussed sort of what is visible and what is invisible in our areas, how that relates to aesthetics and a particular aesthetic decision. If we think of that aesthetic decision and this line between what's visible and invisible as being reflective of our values and reflective of our identity, of who we are as a city, who we are as individuals, who we are as artists, as architects, engineers, what if we were to try to answer that question of like, what is that story that we're telling to ourselves about who we are?
Right.
What would that story be? What might that story be?
Thank you, Christian, for repeating that. I think it's like curiosity is the story I want to tell and to cultivate and to ask other people to consider, you know, like just that curiosity of what is this experience like that I might not know about, right? Or where is nature and how do we use green infrastructure, and you know how, like, that curiosity is the story I want us to practice, if that makes sense. Like, that's the part I would like us to practice, is that curiosity of those lines.
And I'll reflect on, and first off, this is why I loved having Christian in my class, right? A bunch of engineers and then somebody like him to ask these questions, right? And to really make us think deeply. And I remember, this was 3 years ago, but I remember an engineer reflecting on one of our discussions that we're having in class of how designing water infrastructure, her entire career, she was designing water infrastructure systems, and not once did she ever talk to the people that were living and using those infrastructure systems. So one thing that Planet Texas has taught me, and being involved in such a cross-disciplinary team of people, is how important co-designing solutions are, right? And how important it's not just designing for your stakeholders, but it's designing with your stakeholders. Because oftentimes if you're designing flood resilient infrastructure systems, communities that live in a certain area every day, they will know the more problematic areas. So we can actually use our higher level models and refine them with help from our community stakeholders by co-designing with our community. So I think that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but as you were speaking, it just reminded me of that discussion that we had in class 3 years ago.
I just love that they spoke about, because they fully understood it. Now that she spoke, I'll give you some sort of, like Waterloo Park. So there is, what is the story we want to say, right? Austin, as everybody knows, we are a very sort of a progressive city. Everybody loves to come. There's a lot of conversation about how we are the blue dot and the red state and all of that stuff. But you know, we have a history, right? We have done some things in the past that we should not be proud of. And some of those things are like the I-35 was East Avenue, which divided our communities. And Waterloo Park, when we did all of that, we very intentionally went in to undo some of those things. I think sort of a growth of a city, the story to tell for a city like us is how do we kind of like learn from our past and do what we have to do as we do investments in our future. And so Waterloo Park, a big investment is how that used to be one of the major parks for the community. And it was basically divided by I-35. Like people from the other side just couldn't come anymore. So one of the major aspects of that was to make sure that we do community events. A large portion of, there's a Moody Theater named after the other philanthropist who gave, it's a public-private partnership. But we are going to be hosting a large majority of community events at the park that is part of the programming. And that's another part of the story, right? It's not just like the things that happened in the past. And Fernanda spoke about how we need to co-collaborate and have the community. That's a big part of what we do. Like community engagement is just like, we spend so much time engaging with the community. Oh, talk about Amplify Austin. I'll do a plug for Watershed. There's something called Rain to River that's going on. It's called the Strategic Master Plan. Please go there and provide your input. That's another plug I'll do. But I think we are trying to, Austin's brand is an environmentally conscious city, like, Music City capital and all of that. But another major brand is environment. And the way we do these things is also the story we say, I would argue. So.
And just to be sort of transparent about my intentions here, the question about story, it wasn't just because I'm an artist and I think in story, but it's not a big leap from thinking about the stories we tell to ourselves to our understanding of our own history, right? And so I love that you brought that forward, Ramesh, of like, you know, we are progressive, but in a very sort of like white liberal way, right? That we are like, we do the work, but we like to ignore our history, right? And so not just like division, but like active segregation, like that was coded into the laws of the city and stuff like that. So we're close to time, but this is actually kind of where I wanted us to move forward, to sort of end roughly. I don't know, you can't really end, I don't believe in endings, but which is, are there like, it's a bit of an open question, but it's like, are there any other ways that we think that and so the last question that we had prepared is sort of, how do you think this division of visible to invisible contributes to inequity? And we had the last one that was about, or there was another section of it that was like, how would things be different if we move the line from visible to invisible? But I kind of want to linger on the inequity piece because we're thinking about resilience and the history of our city. Are there we've touched upon it a little bit in terms of labor, but are there other ways you think this division between visible and invisible, what's visible and what's invisible contributes to inequity? I'll give you an example. In my work as a director, directors tend to have the peculiar ability to sort of define what their labor is, like what is and isn't their job, or like what is or isn't, like the way by which they conduct their work, in ways that doesn't always allow company members, like actors or designers, to question those means. And there's a long history behind that that's tied back to European directors. So as a director, I have the power, and a director-producer, I have the means to sort of choose what to reveal to the companies, to the people that I'm bringing to work on my projects. And so I try to be transparent about that. I don't always do it, but there's power, right? There's an exercise of power that I do as a director-producer in what I reveal and who's in the room when I'm having various conversations, right? And in various ways, that process intersects with the broader world, identity markers, economic, like class, age, all kinds of things, right? So there's a clear intersection there, even if it's just a play. And so I'm curious for you all, how do you think this line between visible and invisible contributes, perpetuates, or might begin to undo some inequities? It's a big question.
I-35 is like a really great example that's local here. But we have that all over the country and all over the world, right? So most vulnerable communities tend to be located or co-located near areas that might have more air pollution. And I'll give an example of the Southeast Texas Urban Integrated Field Lab, right? That Paula leads, I'm part of, many of us are part of here in this room. This is in the Beaumont-Port Arthur area, the energy heart of the energy hub, right, of our country. Largest refinery in the United States is there. The people that work in those refineries suffer from chronic air pollution. And we all visited for several days in the area at the launch of the research project. And one thing is reading about it and writing about it. Another thing is actually going there and seeing it and smelling it. And what they smell every day and what they live every day when they go to the doctor for their annual checkups. Anybody that lives in that region automatically gets an x-ray because there's chronic cases of lung cancer in the area. So and those are the people that provide energy for us all, right, in this country. And look, that's the price that they're paying, right? And so that's another group of individuals that we all have all of this here all around us, but a lot of people are really sacrificing a lot to be able to give us all of this energy that we have and that we thrive on.
And that goes back both to the aesthetics conversation we had earlier, right? Like there's a reason developers are building here in Austin and not there. But it's also goes back to the question of labor and sort of systematic, like, it is it is a sacrifice, but it's also like it's probable that many of the folks who work those jobs don't feel like they have much of a choice, right? And so it's a little bit of like a forced sacrifice almost in that regard. But thank you.
I mean, so I was going to say I-35 is a big part of it, but going back to the 28 master plan and, East Austin was where all the industries were. Like you spoke about everybody gets an X-ray, just reminded me, the Holly power plant used to be on the east side. And for the longest time, it was only very recently it was shut down, just I want to say about 10 years back. And everybody got an air conditioning unit because of the noise. I mean, it was kind of a thing they did. I mean, can you imagine doing that in West Lake? No, you would never do that. And I think part of, just to go back to your original question, how I thought about quite a bit, actually. I took some notes too, I was going to, in case I forget. But I think the way to reimagine that is the way I think there's a couple of things. First of all, climate change, the way it's happening right now, it is no longer just a flood or just a heat storm or just a winter storm. Everything we are getting, and one of the reasons why we are all struggling with these storms year after year after year is because literally every one of them is very, very different from the one before. And the problems are incredibly intersectional and almost requires us to rethink the way we solve problems, right? And I think part of it is people-centric, right? Engineers need to be more people-centric. Like one of the reasons, to be honest with you, why Waller Creek Tunnel is so far down is due to gravity. We have to go from 474 at the inlet to 428 at the lake because we need a grade line to get the water down. There's simple hydraulics there. But what the other piece to it is also like how do we start bringing the human element into our design? And how do you do that design will be a new way of like a paradigm shift, if you will. Like how do you change that, shift that way of thinking? Because that would automatically sort of start making the visible things happen. Like how do we take like Dove Springs, and there are parts of East Austin, how do we take those things into consideration? And how do you build infrastructure there? How do you do economic development? And then also the policies we institute, how are they, we've got all this gentrification going on in East Austin right now, but that was driven by a policy that we thought was a great idea 10 years back, right? Like a corridor, business something corridor. And a lot of those policies are another important piece of what we should be doing as sort of like city builders. Like what is the policy we do if that's going to cause all these unintended consequences in the future? And climate change is it's like one of those things we are really not sure. I just want to throw a little stat before I leave. Just this last storm, the first 14 days, I read the research, I want to share that because I don't want to go. We picked up 60,000 tons of debris in the first 14 days, which is combined the 2 Halloween storms and another storm in between and Winter Storm Uri. All of that combined was 20,000 tons. Just this one, we picked up 60,000 tons, and we're still not yet done, just in the first 14 days. And people are all like, okay, we had this power outage in Uri, how come we're not able to do it now? Because the one we got this time was so much bigger and wilder and all kinds of different, and that's why these problems need to be solved differently. So.
Just to pull something out real quickly from what you shared, earlier you had talked about how some of the invisible becomes visible in a crisis. And so it seems like like climate change, but also all of these freak weather events, or maybe normal weather events, are kind of against our regardless of our aesthetic decisions and our stories about ourselves, they're kind of pulling that line back, right, between what's visible and what's invisible. And so the agency of nature. Anyway. Right. Chrissy?
Yeah, thank you. A quick thing that I want to share, the story of Austin that I actually read from Dr. Catherine Pace about how we really became segregated was when emancipation hit Austin. People who were enslaved were maybe given land or had left over land to find. And where was that land? But in the lowlands, in the creek beds where they would be flooded out periodically, frequently, right? Like we have a lot of wet rain events here. We have a tunnel that stops Waller Creek from flooding, but in the 1800s, in 1910, it was a huge flood that actually took out part of South Congress. So like there are different, so that those Clarksville was a freed community on Shoal Creek, which still floods, right? Robertson Hill and Waller Creek really was part of one of those. A lot of little communities kind of came up around Waller Creek too. So really, what Dr. Pace argues is that the dividing line in the city was not actually Eastern Avenue or I-35. That really before that it was Waller Creek. And so that sort of sense of segregation and that kind of, freed communities developing in lowlands happens all over the South, right? That's a story of the South, but that's really part of the story of Austin. And what I think makes me really sad about our community is right now it is still one of the most economically segregated cities in the country. Right? And so I think, Christian, you're asking us, how do we envision, how does visibility help us envision a future that I would, many of us would like to see more equitable, not less equitable. I think even if across the political spectrum, I think people could agree on some part of that, right? I think that's why I think I answered about curiosity before, like how can we be curious to learn a perspective that's not ours, to see things in a different way, and how can we from that notice the nuance, the complexity, even for me, not even a student of city policy, but partnering with city departments, learning the complexities of what goes into any civil project is incredible. And so knowing that from a city, governance perspective, and then also being able to work in community and seeing that from a lived experience, place-based, neighborhood, people on the ground, people live where we live kind of perspective too. So I think there's just all of these like details and nuance that we maybe I would like us to have more tolerance for. Right. Taking in those complicated stories, right? Those complex pieces, because we like a quick aesthetic. Yeah. So I think those are my that kind of curiosity, room for complexity, and I would say and collaboration, right? How do we start? How do we co-design? How do we co-create? How do we co-problem solve? How do we help our neighbor in that crisis moment, right? Or say thank you to the people who picked up 60,000 tons of debris. Yeah. How do we recognize that work? Yeah.
We had a breakfast taco thing this morning, but
Okay.
No. But doing this is one way to recognize these videos. But I was also going to say, look, I'll just take off my City of Austin hat for a half second and put on I came from India. I think our tolerance to failure is so low in this country, in this world, in this Austin that there should be some idea. You guys are academics. There's something called accepted failure. I mean, there's some concept where we need to have. You can never learn if you don't fail a little bit, And we need to maybe have a measured laboratory failure, risk of tolerance, a whole way, because you'll never learn. Because back in India, this issue that we had it wouldn't be as big of a deal as it was in Austin. Yeah. But then that's because that's their learned response over there. But I do think that as a world, we are very zero tolerance. Nothing can go wrong. Like we can't lose power for like half an hour, that kind of deal. I think we need to have a little bit more of. It's okay if you don't have Wi-Fi for a couple of hours, So it's kind of we should have that.
Nobody really thinks about infrastructure unless you're stuck in traffic, right. You're out of power, your internet doesn't work, right? And that's when we think about these systems, right? Exactly. Actively think about these systems. Yeah,
there's that expectation of they're always running, everything's always fine, which means that when it isn't fine, we also don't have and I would say the physical, emotional somatic capacity to respond to things not being. I finished the last 2 years of high school in India, in Maharashtra.
Okay.
And my high school was in a very rural area, so we would lose power habitually. And I got super used to it. And so I was back there this year, and the power and the power outage happened, and I freaked out. But everybody else was fine. And so there's something a little bit of that like cultural response as well of being used to.
For sure, I'm not justifying weeks and weeks of power loss or any of those things, okay? But I'm just saying that there will be a little bit of, I think we learn a lot when those things happen on what does resiliency look like how do you recover from it, should we have, like now I see everybody, like, this morning I had like a major crisis, my car wouldn't start. And I had like I didn't know what I'm gonna do, that kind of situation. I'm like, I came from India where this would not even be a thing. But that's kind of how we've gotten used to. We've become very, how shall I put it, programmed to sort of expecting everything to work all the time.
And I would say also, just to end because we're close to time, I would also say that building on the curiosity and the sort of cultural expectations, there's a little bit of an element of making sense of these visible and invisible categories with other people. As a grad student at UT, I've had experiences where I'm like, is this normal? Like, should I know this? Should I not know this? And it's going to my colleagues, other grad students, to kind of co-validate our experiences of like what is or isn't happening, or what should or shouldn't be happening, and similar like about the storm, or about like how the city functions. Just being able to talk to other people and be like, are we? Is it, And so, and that is something that we cannot do in isolation. Like the storm, I think, we talked about this a little bit in planning the conference, but like the most recent winter storm was such an individualized experience based on where you lived in the city, and whether you had childcare, whether you lost power, whether you had trauma from the 2021 winter storm. But being able to sort of come together with other people, and this is what we do in the theater or in the performing arts, that's something you can't do on your own. Like you have to do that work with other people. And so with that, let's give these fine folks a round of applause. Thank you. And I think that's it. Thank you all so much.
For opening as well. Yeah.